tonight something remarkable happened, and almost nobody in the corporate press wants to talk about it honestly. A foreign government official, not a blogger, not a partisan activist, not a social media troll, but the sitting ambassador of a close American ally publicly attacked an American commentator for asking questions about United States foreign policy. Not policy in Tel Aviv, not policy in Jerusalem, policy in Washington, D.C. That distinction is not trivial. It is the entire point. The ambassador of Israel to the United States denounced commentary suggesting that American decisions regarding Iran might be influenced by Israeli strategic interests. He described that commentary as bordering on pornography, for raising questions about geopolitical influence, alliance priorities, and strategic alignment. That word choice matters. The outrage matters. And the reaction, or rather, the conspicuous lack of reaction from our political class matters even more. Because this isn't about hurt feelings. It isn't about tone. It isn't about rhetorical style. It is about sovereignty. It is about who gets to ask questions in a democracy. It is about whether American foreign policy is determined by American voters through their elected representatives, or whether it is shaped, constrained, or influenced by forces that voters are quietly discouraged from discussing. This is not a small story. It is not a niche controversy confined to pundits and diplomats. It is a defining moment that reveals something deeper about the boundaries of permissible debate in the United States. When a foreign ambassador publicly moralizes an American citizen's analysis of American foreign policy, something unusual has occurred. Diplomacy traditionally operates with restraint. Ambassadors represent their nations, but they tread carefully inside the domestic political environment of their host country. That is basic diplomatic protocol. You advocate for your nation's interests, yes. You build relationships, you lobby, you negotiate, but you do not publicly shame private citizens for participating in political discourse within their own democracy. That crosses an invisible but important line. Yet here, that line was crossed openly, and the reaction from Washington's political establishment was telling. There was no unified defense of free inquiry, no ringing affirmation that Americans have the right to scrutinize their own government's decisions, no bipartisan insistence that foreign policy debate must remain open and robust. Instead, there was silence. And silence in moments like this is not neutral. Silence signals comfort. Silence signals acquiescence. Silence signals hierarchy. There is something uniquely radioactive about asking how alliances shape American decisions, especially when the subject is Israel. The United States maintains alliances around the globe. It is part of NATO. It maintains security commitments in Asia. It provides military aid to dozens of countries. The influence of foreign governments in Washington is not a secret. It is institutionalized. Lobbying is legal. Advocacy groups operate openly. Political donations flow through established channels. Congressional hearings frequently examine foreign influence, foreign funding, and foreign interference. We discuss French influence, we debate Saudi influence, we scrutinize Chinese influence, we analyze Ukrainian influence. Entire media cycles are dedicated to investigating how these governments attempt to shape American policy. No one suggests that raising such questions is immoral. No one calls it indecent to explore how lobbying, diplomacy, and strategic alignment affect decision-making in Washington. But when the conversation turns toward Israel's influence on American strategy in the Middle East, something changes. The temperature spikes. The tone shifts. The language becomes moralized. Instead of arguing about facts, critics are accused of harboring prejudice. Instead of debating strategic interests, the discussion becomes about character and intent. Why? This week, the Israeli ambassador to the United States did not simply disagree with commentary. Disagreement is normal. Disagreement is healthy. Disagreement is expected in a functioning democracy. Instead, he framed the commentary as morally perverse. He used language designed not merely to refute, but to delegitimize. By labeling geopolitical analysis as bordering on pornography, he implied that even examining the subject was indecent. That rhetorical move is significant. When policy discussion is framed as taboo, power often resides there. In democratic systems, sunlight is supposed to disinfect. Transparency is supposed to strengthen legitimacy. If an alliance is strong, if its strategic logic is sound, it should withstand scrutiny. In fact, it should welcome scrutiny. Open examination builds trust. But when scrutiny itself becomes suspect, when analysis is treated as contamination, that suggests discomfort. It suggests vulnerability. It suggests that certain topics are insulated not because they are false, but because they are sensitive. And sensitivity in foreign policy often reveals the intersection of power, money, history, and emotion. The U.S.-Israel relationship is layered with all four. It is rooted in post-World War II moral reckoning. It is reinforced by military cooperation. It is strengthened by intelligence sharing. It is supported by strong advocacy networks inside the United States. It is defended passionately by politicians across party lines. None of that is controversial. All of it is well documented. What becomes controversial is asking how that relationship influences specific policy choices, especially when those choices involve war, sanctions, or escalation. To understand why this debate matters, we have to talk about Iran. The United States and Iran have been adversaries for more than 4 decades. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, relations have been defined by hostility. There have been sanctions. There have been covert operations. There have been proxy conflicts across the Middle East. There have been moments of near direct confrontation in the Persian Gulf. Tensions have ebbed and flowed, but they have never disappeared. For Israel, Iran represents something more than a regional rival. Iranian leaders have openly called for Israel's destruction. Iran funds Hezbollah in Lebanon. It supports Hamas in Gaza. It has pursued nuclear capabilities that Israeli officials view as existential threats. From Israel's perspective, preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons is not optional. It is a matter of national survival. For the United States, the calculation is different. Iran is a hostile regional power. It challenges American influence in the Middle East. It threatens U.S. allies. It disrupts energy markets. It supports militant groups that target American interests. But it does not pose an existential threat to the continental United States. The strategic urgency, therefore, is not identical. That difference matters. Allies can share goals while assigning different levels of urgency to those goals. They can agree on threats while disagreeing about timelines. They can coordinate strategies while maintaining independent cost-benefit analyses. That is normal in international politics. So when an American commentator suggests that U.S. escalation with Iran may reflect Israeli security concerns as much as American ones, that is not bigotry. It is strategic analysis. It is an examination of alliance dynamics. It is a recognition that powerful allies often shape one another's perceptions and decisions. Yet the reaction from diplomatic circles suggests that even exploring this alignment is beyond the pale. Why? Why is strategic analysis treated as moral offense? Why is questioning the degree of influence equated with hostility toward a people or a religion? That conflation is not accidental. It blurs the line between criticism of a state and prejudice against an ethnicity. It transforms policy debate into moral combat. And once that transformation occurs, rational discussion becomes nearly impossible. The United States has historically debated its alliances vigorously. Americans questioned the costs of defending Europe during the Cold War. They questioned the burden sharing within NATO. They questioned interventions in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Debate did not weaken the republic, it strengthened it. It forced policymakers to justify their decisions. If the U.S.-Israel relationship is uniquely insulated from similar scrutiny, then it occupies a special status. And special status in foreign policy invites further inquiry, not less. The intensity of the reaction tells us something important. It tells us that the subject itself is perceived as volatile. And volatility in political discourse is rarely about facts alone. It is about narratives. It is about identity. It is about power. In any other context, examining how alliance commitments shape policy would be considered routine analysis. When the United States coordinates with NATO allies, analysts routinely debate whether American troop deployments reflect shared interests or disproportionate burdens. When Washington negotiates with Gulf states, commentators openly discuss oil politics, arms deals, and strategic trade-offs. When the United States provides military to Ukraine, the conversation includes candid discussions about American interests, European stability, and defense industry implications. No one suggests those debates are immoral, but when similar scrutiny touches Israel, the response often escalates beyond disagreement into accusation. The implication is that even raising the question carries hidden malice. That implication narrows discourse before it even begins. And narrowing discourse has consequences. Foreign policy is among the most consequential areas of governance. It determines war and peace. It shapes economic sanctions that affect millions. It defines alliances that may obligate American soldiers to fight. If citizens cannot examine how those decisions are made and who influences them, democratic oversight erodes. The Iran issue sits at the center of this tension. For years, American administrations have oscillated between confrontation and negotiation. The nuclear agreement negotiated under President Obama sought to limit Iran's enrichment capacity in exchange for sanctions relief. That agreement was later withdrawn under President Trump, who pursued maximum pressure instead. Subsequent administrations have struggled to recalibrate. Throughout these shifts, Israeli leaders have consistently urged a harder line. That is understandable from Israel's perspective. Nations advocate for their survival. But the question remains, when Washington chooses escalation, is it doing so solely on the basis of American calculations, or are allied urgencies amplifying those decisions? That is not a hostile question. It is a governance question. What makes this episode especially revealing is not that a disagreement occurred, but that it escalated diplomatically. Ambassadors are representatives of sovereign governments. Their words carry weight. When they speak publicly, they do so as official voices of their states. Diplomatic practice generally favors subtlety. Criticism is conveyed privately. Disputes are managed behind closed doors. Public condemnation of domestic commentators is unusual because it risks appearing as interference in internal discourse. Yet in this case, the Israeli ambassador chose not merely to defend his nation's policy, but to condemn an American voice in moral terms. He framed commentary about U.S. foreign policy as indecent. That choice signaled confidence. Confidence that such condemnation would not provoke institutional backlash. And it did not. Members of Congress did not rush to defend the principle of open inquiry. Cable news panels did not erupt into debates about diplomatic propriety. Editorial boards did not issue stern warnings about foreign officials policing domestic speech. The silence was almost uniform. Silence in politics often reflects calculation. Politicians measure risk. They evaluate donors. They assess media reaction. If defending free discourse appears more costly than remaining quiet, quiet becomes the default. That dynamic reveals a hierarchy of sensitivities. Certain alliances are treated as foundational beyond public challenge. Politicians from both parties freely describe support for Israel as ironclad. The phrase itself implies permanence. Iron does not bend easily, but democratic systems require flexibility. They require the ability to reassess commitments as circumstances change. Ironclad language can harden debate into orthodoxy. When foreign officials criticize American speech without consequence, it raises a deeper question: who feels empowered within the relationship? Sovereignty is not merely about territorial borders. It is about psychological independence. It is about confidence in one's own decision-making processes. If Americans hesitate to scrutinize an alliance because they fear moral condemnation, sovereignty becomes constrained not by force, but by stigma. The term antisemitism carries immense historical weight, and rightly so. Jewish communities have endured centuries of persecution, discrimination, and violence. The Holocaust remains one of humanity's darkest chapters. 6 million Jews were murdered in a systematic campaign of extermination. That history cannot be minimized. It demands vigilance against hatred in all its forms. Precisely because that history is so grave, accusations of antisemitism must be used carefully. When genuine antisemitism appears, it should be confronted unequivocally. But when the term is extended to include policy disagreements about a nation-state, its meaning risks dilution. Israel is a sovereign country. It has a government. It has political parties and makes strategic decisions. Like any state, it pursues its interests. Criticizing those decisions is not equivalent to condemning a people or a faith. The distinction between ethnicity and state policy is foundational to rational discourse. When that distinction collapses, debate collapses with it. Language can clarify, but it can also intimidate. By equating geopolitical analysis with moral deviance, critics transform discussion into accusation. Once someone is labeled bigoted, their arguments are dismissed without examination. The focus shifts from evidence to intent. This rhetorical strategy is powerful because it leverages historical trauma. No serious person wants to be associated with prejudice. The fear of that association can silence otherwise legitimate inquiry. But democracies cannot function on fear. They require the ability to separate identity from policy. They require citizens to question alliances without being accused of animus. If the United States provides billions in military aid annually, voters have the right to debate that expenditure. If alliance commitments risk military escalation, citizens have the right to examine those risks. That is not hostility, it is accountability. Political scholars have long studied the influence of lobbying in Washington. Advocacy organizations exist across the political spectrum. Some advocate for environmental causes. Others represent pharmaceutical companies. Others focus on human rights or defense policy. Pro-Israel advocacy groups operate within the same legal framework. They raise funds. They endorse candidates. They organize conferences. They lobby legislators. This is not secretive. It is part of the American system. Serious academic work has examined how lobbying shapes foreign policy outcomes. Scholars have debated whether concentrated interest groups can exert disproportionate influence compared to diffuse public opinion. They have explored how campaign finance structures incentivize alignment with organized constituencies. These debates are mainstream within political science departments. Academic discussions about the U.S.-Israel relationship are not rare. Researchers have analyzed how strategic cooperation developed after the 1967 Six-Day War. They have traced how military aid expanded during the Cold War. They have examined intelligence sharing arrangements and joint defense projects. Some scholars argue that the alliance strengthens American influence in the Middle East. Others contend that it entangles the United States in regional disputes. These arguments appear in peer-reviewed journals without triggering moral panic. So why does similar analysis in mass media provoke outrage? One explanation lies in audience reach. Academic debates remain confined to specialized readerships. They influence policy elites gradually. Public commentary, by contrast, reaches voters directly. It shapes electoral discourse. It challenges narratives that politicians rely upon. When analysis moves from seminar rooms to television screens, its political impact increases. An increased impact generates resistance from those invested in the status quo. Another factor is messaging discipline. Political establishments prefer predictable narratives. They prefer consensus framing that minimizes internal division. Public debate about alliance influence introduces complexity. Complexity disrupts messaging. Yet complexity is unavoidable in foreign policy. Alliances are rarely simple. They involve trade-offs. They involve competing priorities. They require constant reassessment. Suppressing discussion does not eliminate those trade-offs. It merely obscures them. If the American public perceives that certain topics are off-limits, trust erodes. People begin to suspect that decisions are made behind closed doors, insulated from scrutiny. Whether that suspicion is accurate or exaggerated becomes secondary. The perception itself damages legitimacy. Open debate, even when uncomfortable, strengthens legitimacy. It demonstrates confidence in democratic processes. It signals that alliances can withstand examination because their foundations are secure. When criticism is met with moral condemnation rather than counterargument, insecurity becomes visible. And that visibility brings us to the deeper issue beneath this controversy: sovereignty, not only as a legal principle, but as a cultural one. At its core, this controversy is not about one commentator, one ambassador, or even one alliance. It is about sovereignty, not just territorial sovereignty, but intellectual sovereignty. Who ultimately determines the boundaries of acceptable debate within the United States? Who decides which questions may be asked without reputational punishment? Sovereignty in a republic begins with the people. Citizens delegate authority to elected officials. Those officials conduct foreign policy on behalf of the electorate. But delegation does not mean abdication. The public retains the right to scrutinize the decisions made in its name. When foreign policy becomes insulated from scrutiny because of diplomatic sensitivities, democratic accountability weakens. Alliances are necessary in a complex world. No nation operates alone, but alliances must remain subject to periodic reassessment. Circumstances change, threats evolve, economic realities shift. What made strategic sense 20 years ago may require recalibration today. If voters feel they cannot question alliance commitments without facing moral condemnation, their role shrinks. The public sphere narrows. Debate becomes performative rather than substantive. The First Amendment was not designed to protect only popular opinions. It was designed precisely to safeguard uncomfortable inquiry. The framers of the Constitution understood that self-government requires friction. It requires disagreement. It requires the ability to challenge prevailing orthodoxies. When foreign officials publicly shame domestic commentators and domestic institutions echo that shame, the signal sent is chilling. It suggests that certain alliances occupy a sacred space beyond democratic negotiation, but nothing in a republic is sacred in that way. Policies are tools, not idols. They must serve the people, not the other way around. Healthy democracies distinguish between prejudice and policy analysis. Prejudice targets identity. Policy analysis targets decisions. Confusing the two corrodes civic life. It transforms disagreement into accusation and discourages nuanced thinking. The United States has navigated complex alliances before. During the Cold War, Americans debated the wisdom of supporting authoritarian regimes in the name of containment. They argued about arms control treaties with the Soviet Union. They questioned military interventions in Central America. Those debates were fierce, yet they were understood as part of democratic responsibility. Digital media amplifies rhetoric. Outrage travels faster than explanation. Nuance struggles to compete with accusation. In such an environment, the temptation to moralize policy disputes grows stronger. Moral framing simplifies narratives. It divides actors into heroes and villains. It reduces complex strategic calculations to binary judgments. But foreign policy rarely fits into moral binaries. Nations pursue interests. They balance risks. They weigh alliances against autonomy. Citizens must be able to examine those calculations without fear. The relationship between the United States and Israel is multifaceted. It includes shared democratic values, intelligence cooperation, technological exchange, and military collaboration. It also includes political lobbying, campaign finance considerations, and diplomatic pressures. Recognizing the latter does not negate the former. It simply acknowledges reality. If the alliance is robust, it can withstand scrutiny. If the strategic logic is sound, it can be defended with evidence rather than moral denunciation. Silencing inquiry does not eliminate doubts. It pushes them underground where they fester. Open discussion allows misconceptions to be corrected and legitimate concerns to be addressed. Suppression breeds conspiracy. Transparency builds trust. The episode that sparked this controversy may seem minor compared to wars and treaties, but symbolic moments often reveal structural truths. When a foreign ambassador confidently polices American discourse and American institutions respond with quiet compliance, it suggests that the boundaries of debate have shifted. Shifts like that accumulate. One taboo becomes two, one sensitive topic becomes several. Gradually, citizens internalize limits they were never formally given. They self-censor. They avoid questions that might attract stigma. A foreign ambassador publicly condemned an American commentator for questioning United States foreign policy. The condemnation framed strategic analysis as moral deviance. The political establishment responded with near silence. That sequence is not trivial. It reveals how sensitive certain alliances have become, and how hesitant institutions are to defend open inquiry when that sensitivity is triggered. This is not about hostility toward a nation or a people. It is about preserving the distinction between identity and policy. It is about ensuring that American voters retain the authority to examine how their government makes decisions. It is about reaffirming that no alliance, however close, exists beyond scrutiny. Democracy requires open debate, not curated debate, not approved debate, open debate. The strength of a republic is measured not by the absence of disagreement, but by its capacity to handle disagreement without collapsing into accusation. Pay attention to language. When criticism of policy is equated with prejudice, ask whether that equation is justified. When foreign officials comment on domestic discourse, consider what that implies about diplomatic norms. When politicians remain silent in defense of open inquiry, ask why. The health of self-government depends on vigilance. Rights erode gradually, often under the banner of protecting sensitivities. The ability to question power, whether domestic or foreign, is foundational to citizenship. There will always be uncomfortable questions in foreign policy. That discomfort is not a flaw. It is evidence that democracy is functioning. The alternative, unquestioned orthodoxy enforced through stigma, belongs to systems less confident in their own legitimacy. Americans face a choice. They can accept narrowing boundaries of debate, or they can insist that alliance politics remain subject to the same scrutiny applied to every other domain of governance. They can allow moral intimidation to define discourse, or they can reaffirm the principle that inquiry is not indecency. A republic does not weaken when its citizens ask hard questions. It weakens when they stop asking. And right now, there are questions some people clearly do not want asked. The real test is whether Americans will ask them anyway.